I never thought I'd find myself at war with my HOA, but life has a funny way of turning peaceful neighborhoods into battlegrounds. It all started the day I moved into my dream home, a beautiful house with a sparkling swimming pool in the backyard. I worked hard for years to afford this place, and every time I sat by the pool, I felt like I had finally made it. At first, everything was perfect. Quiet mornings with coffee by the water, summer afternoons splashing with my niece, and peaceful evenings watching the sunset. I kept my property spotless, mowed lawn, fresh flowers, the whole picture-perfect image. But apparently, someone wasn't happy with my little slice of heaven. Her name was Karen, and if you've ever dealt with an HOA, you probably know a Karen. Middle-aged, always peering over fences, and somehow always in charge. She was the HOA president, and her power trip was no secret. The first time we met, she gave me a long speech about community standards and how the HOA expected every homeowner to contribute positively. I smiled and nodded, thinking it was just a routine welcome chat. I had no idea how far she'd go to make my life miserable. The trouble started small, passive-aggressive letters in my mailbox. "Your grass is 1 inch too long," one said. Another complained about my pool chairs being too colorful. I brushed them off, thinking she was just overly strict. But then, the fines started. First, a $50 fine for leaving my trash bin out 5 minutes past collection time. Then $100 for having a non-approved garden gnome. It was ridiculous. I tried to keep my cool, but Karen seemed to have it out for me. No matter how much I complied, another notice would arrive. I knew I wasn't the only one she targeted. Other neighbors rolled their eyes when her name came up. But no one dared to stand up to her. She ruled the HOA like a queen, and challenging her meant endless fines and headaches. One day, after a long week at work, I came home to find a letter taped to my door. It was a formal warning. "Your pool maintenance is below HOA standards." I blinked at the paper, confused. My pool was spotless, crystal clear. I even paid extra for a professional service to keep it perfect. I knew this wasn't about pool maintenance. It was personal. I decided I wouldn't let Karen push me around anymore. But nothing could have prepared me for what she did next. The next morning, I woke up to a smell so bad it made my stomach churn. I rushed to my backyard and froze. My swimming pool, the pride of my home, was filled with garbage. Bags of rotting food, broken furniture, and even old car parts floated in the water. At first, I couldn't believe it. Who would do something so disgusting? But then, I noticed something that made my blood boil. A crumpled HOA letter sitting on top of the mess. The message was clear. Karen had finally crossed the line. And that's when I decided, if she wanted a war, she was going to get one. I stood at the edge of my pool, the stench of rotting garbage hanging thick in the air. My stomach twisted as I scanned the mess. Plastic bags leaking brown sludge, broken pieces of wood floating aimlessly, and worse, food scraps already attracting flies. My once pristine swimming pool now looked like a landfill. I clenched my fists, rage bubbling up inside me. I knew this wasn't some random prank. This had Karen written all over it. She'd been pushing my buttons for months, but this was beyond petty fines or passive-aggressive letters. This was personal. And she expected me to stay quiet. Not this time. I grabbed my phone and snapped pictures from every angle. I documented everything. Close-ups of the trash, wide shots of the pool, even a picture of the crumpled HOA letter sitting on top of the floating garbage. I knew I would need every piece of evidence if I wanted to fight back. But I needed proof. Real, undeniable proof that Karen was behind this. I took a deep breath and stormed back into the house, my mind racing with ideas. Then it hit me. My security cameras. I had installed them a month after moving in, thanks to a break-in scare down the street. If Karen was bold enough to dump trash in my pool, there was no way she avoided the cameras. I rushed to my laptop, heart pounding, and pulled up the footage. My fingers trembled as I scrolled through the timeline until I spotted movement at 2:37 a.m. My breath hitched. There, clear as day, was Karen, wearing her usual oversized cardigan, dragging garbage bags through the side gate. I watched in disbelief as she heaved bag after bag over the edge, her face twisted in satisfaction. She didn't even try to hide it. I leaned back in my chair, heart pounding in my chest. This wasn't just a hunch anymore. I had cold, hard proof. My anger sharpened into focus. Karen thought she could get away with this because no one had ever stood up to her. But I wasn't like the others. I wasn't going to roll over and take it. The next morning I started my plan. First, I sent copies of the security footage and pool photos to the HOA board's official email. I crafted the email carefully. No anger, just cold, factual language. Dear HOA Board, I am writing to report a serious violation by HOA President Karen last name. I have attached photographic and video evidence showing her trespassing on my property and illegally dumping waste into my swimming pool on the night of date. I request an immediate investigation and appropriate disciplinary action. Respectfully, my name. I knew Karen had allies on the board, but I also knew they couldn't ignore hard evidence. If they did, I had another card to play: local law enforcement. But I wasn't done yet. I spent the rest of the morning consulting a lawyer. I wanted to know my rights, and more importantly, how I could turn the tables on Karen legally. My lawyer, a sharp-tongued woman named Vanessa, didn't hold back. She trespassed. That's a criminal offense, Vanessa said firmly. And if her actions caused property damage or cleanup costs, you can sue her personally, and the HOA if they refuse to act. Hearing that gave me a rush of satisfaction. I had options. Real power. I scheduled an official complaint with the police and paid for a professional cleanup crew to restore my pool. It cost me nearly $1,200, but I kept every receipt. Karen wasn't just going to pay emotionally. I planned to make her pay financially. As I watched the cleanup crew fish out the last bag of garbage, I realized something. This wasn't just about revenge. This was about showing Karen and the entire HOA that I wasn't someone to mess with. And I was just getting started. The day after I filed my complaint with the HOA, the neighborhood was buzzing. My email and the damning evidence had circulated faster than I expected. It seemed like everyone had an opinion, but one thing was clear. People were starting to question Karen's leadership. I knew Karen would find out soon enough, but I wasn't about to sit back and wait for her to strike again. I had a plan to make sure everyone saw the truth, and there was no way she could spin her way out of it. By noon, I received an official reply from the HOA board. We have received your complaint and supporting evidence. A formal hearing will be scheduled to review these allegations. A hearing. Perfect. That meant everything would be documented and public for the entire HOA community to witness. If Karen thought she could bully her way through this, she was in for a rude awakening. But I wasn't stopping there. I uploaded a carefully edited version of the security footage onto the private HOA Facebook group, a place where residents aired grievances, shared updates, and apparently exposed corrupt HOA presidents. I didn't include any personal commentary, just the raw truth. To my fellow neighbors, here's what HOA leadership does when they think no one is watching. This happened in my backyard. Within minutes, the video blew up. Comments flooded in. Is this real? Karen has lost her mind. This is unacceptable. She needs to be removed. By the time I refreshed the page, the post had over 100 reactions, and I knew Karen couldn't silence all of us. Just as I expected, my phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number. I smiled, already knowing who it was. "Hello?" I answered, keeping my voice calm. "You think you're clever, don't you?" Karen's voice dripped with venom. "I think I'm tired of your nonsense," I shot back. "And now everyone else sees what kind of person you really are." "You're going to regret this," she snapped. "I doubt it. But you might want to brush up on trespassing laws. You'll be hearing from my lawyer soon." I hung up before she could respond, my heart racing with adrenaline. I wasn't scared of her threats. If anything, I was just getting started. That evening, I spotted Karen pacing furiously outside her home, talking to someone on the phone. She looked rattled, desperate. I could only imagine the pressure she was under as more neighbors turned against her. And then, I decided to twist the knife a little deeper. I called a local news station. It wasn't just about embarrassing Karen. It was about protecting myself. If Karen had crossed the line this badly with me, who knew how far she'd go with others? By sharing my story publicly, I'd ensure she couldn't sweep this under the rug. The reporter was immediately interested. "HOA abuse stories always get attention," he said. "If you're willing to go on record, we'll cover it." I agreed without hesitation. The more light I shined on Karen's behavior, the less room she had to hide. 2 days later, the news segment aired. HOA president accused of vandalizing homeowner's property, caught on camera. They played the security footage in full, my lawyer's statement, and clips from interviews with other homeowners who had their own horror stories about Karen's reign. By the time the segment ended, my inbox was flooded with supportive messages from neighbors who had been too scared to speak out. Until now. Karen wanted to play dirty. But I wasn't just going to clean up the mess. I was going to destroy her entire game. After the news story aired, things in the neighborhood shifted fast. The once intimidating Karen was now the talk of every conversation. Except instead of fear, people were full of outrage. It was like I had ripped the blindfold off, and suddenly, everyone was realizing just how far she had overstepped. I didn't stop at the news segment, though. I wanted to make sure she couldn't wriggle her way out of this mess with her usual manipulation. So I took it a step further. I reached out to every homeowner I knew who had faced Karen's bullying, excessive fines, mysterious HOA rule changes, and sudden violations that seemed to pop up whenever she had a grudge. People were more than willing to share their stories. I compiled everything into a formal report, a detailed, organized list of her abuses, complete with witness statements, timestamps, and records of fines she had imposed. But the crown jewel, the footage of her dumping trash in my pool, that image alone was enough to light a fire under the board. At the next HOA meeting, an emergency session I requested, there was barely an empty seat in the room. People I had never seen before came out, eager to hear what I had to say. And of course, Karen was there, sitting at the head of the table, her usual smug expression faltering under the weight of everyone's stares. I stood up to speak. "Thank you for coming," I began, scanning the room. "I didn't expect to find myself here, but when someone crosses the line as blatantly as our HOA president did, it's my responsibility to speak up." I pulled up the video on the projector screen. The gasps were audible as the footage showed Karen and her husband sneaking into my backyard with black garbage bags. "This," I said, pointing to the screen, "is your HOA leadership at work. Not only is this a clear act of trespassing, but it also demonstrates a blatant abuse of power. And, as you'll soon see, this isn't an isolated incident. I spent the next 20 minutes detailing the harassment I had endured, plus the experiences of others who had stepped forward. Every time Karen tried to interrupt, the board shut her down. The weight of evidence was impossible to ignore. When I finished, the room fell silent. I could see Karen gripping the edges of the table, her knuckles white. I moved for a vote of no confidence in Karen's leadership. I declared, my voice steady. One by one, hands shot up. I second the motion, a neighbor across the room added. The vote wasn't even close. Within minutes, Karen was stripped of her position as HOA president, effective immediately. She tried to protest, claiming this was all a personal attack, but no one was buying it anymore. I could almost feel the power slipping from her grasp, and it was satisfying in a way I hadn't expected. For so long, she had ruled with intimidation and manipulation. But now, she was just another disgraced bully with no authority left to wield. But I wasn't finished. I had one more surprise up my sleeve. As the new acting board has clearly seen, I said, turning to face the remaining members, I'm within my legal rights to seek compensation for the damage to my property. If the HOA does not resolve this, I'll be taking further legal action. A heavy silence settled over the room. The board members exchanged glances before the chairperson cleared his throat. We'll be discussing a financial settlement for the damages, he said carefully. Karen's face turned beet red. She knew exactly what that meant. The HOA funds she had been controlling were about to pay for her reckless behavior. But I still wasn't done. Later that week, I hired a team to clean and restore my pool to pristine condition, paid for by the HOA. I didn't stop there, though. I made sure to install a brand new pool heater and luxury lounge area, all covered by the settlement. And to add a final personal touch, I had a custom sign made, Karen's Memorial Pool, courtesy of HOA's finest. It was petty, but after everything she put me through, it felt right. Karen couldn't handle the public humiliation. Within a month, she sold her house and moved out of the neighborhood entirely. No one missed her. In the end, I didn't just clean up the mess she left behind. I made sure she could never make one again. With Karen removed as HOA president and my pool fully restored, at her expense, you might think the story ended there. But for me, it wasn't enough to simply clean up the mess. I wanted to make sure no one else would ever face the kind of harassment I had endured. So I decided to play the long game. The first step? Running for a position on the HOA board. With Karen gone, there was an empty seat, and I knew no one else was more motivated to keep the HOA in check than I was. My neighbors, still buzzing from Karen's downfall, welcomed the idea. In a unanimous vote, I was elected as the new vice president of the HOA, giving me direct oversight over everything Karen once controlled. The first thing I did? Audit the HOA's finances. It didn't take long to uncover how Karen had been misusing funds. Hidden among the regular expenses were suspicious charges, personal landscaping, spa visits, and other luxuries Karen had passed off as HOA maintenance. I compiled everything into a formal report and submitted it to legal counsel. Within weeks, Karen received a legal notice demanding reimbursement for the stolen funds. I wasn't just making her pay, I was making sure she faced real consequences. But my revenge didn't stop there. I decided to use the reclaimed funds to improve the community, starting with my favorite target, my backyard. I transformed my property into a community hub. I expanded my pool area into a luxury gathering space complete with a fire pit, a shaded lounge area, and even a small outdoor movie screen. It became the place where neighbors gathered for block parties and summer movie nights, all hosted by me, free of charge. The best part? I made it a point to invite everyone, except Karen. She still lived in the neighborhood, but the days of her power were long gone. Seeing my yard filled with laughter and joy, funded by the very HOA she had abused, was a poetic twist she couldn't escape. To add a bit of flair, I installed a custom pool float shaped like a garbage bag, a not-so-subtle reminder of her failed attempt to humiliate me. Whenever she drove by, I made sure it was proudly displayed in the water. But the crown jewel of my revenge plan was still in the works. As vice president, I proposed a new policy called the Community Accountability Clause. It required that any HOA official caught abusing their power would be permanently barred from serving on the board again, ensuring someone like Karen could never rise to power. The motion passed without resistance, cementing my legacy and ending her reign for good. Karen tried to keep a low profile after that. She avoided HOA meetings, skipped community events, and no longer strutted around the neighborhood like she owned it. The final blow came a few months later when I learned that her husband had filed for divorce. Apparently, my actions had exposed not just her public misdeeds, but also the private fractures in her life. I wasn't proud of ruining her marriage, but I couldn't deny the satisfaction I felt knowing she was finally facing the fallout of her behavior. Meanwhile, my life had never been better. My neighbors respected me. My pool was the heart of the community, and I had transformed the HOA from a tool of harassment into a genuine force for good. And every time I floated in my crystal-clear pool, sipping a cold drink and watching the sunset, I couldn't help but smile. Because in the end, Karen's attempt to trash my life only made it better. With Karen's reign of terror officially over and my position as HOA vice president firmly established, life in the neighborhood took a turn for the better. The oppressive rules that Karen had weaponized against us were reviewed and revised under my watch. I made sure that no homeowner would ever feel trapped or targeted again. One of my first major acts? I passed a motion allowing more personal freedom in how people maintain their properties. No more arbitrary fines for small things like leaving your garage door open for an hour or having a flower pot that didn't fit the community aesthetic. My goal was to restore a sense of fairness and to ensure that no one else endured the harassment I did. But despite her public fall from grace, Karen wasn't quite finished with her petty antics. Even though she was permanently barred from serving on the HOA board, she still lived in the neighborhood, and her bitterness was impossible to miss. She refused to acknowledge me in public, and whenever she saw me working on my yard, she'd make loud, snide comments to anyone nearby about how I had ruined the community. I didn't care. I had already won. But I wanted to deliver one final message to make it clear that her days of bullying were permanently over. I decided to host the biggest neighborhood party the community had ever seen. Using a portion of the recovered HOA funds, yes, the same money Karen had stolen, I organized a summer bash in my backyard. I spared no expense. Catered food trucks, live music, outdoor games, and even a professional fireworks display. I invited everyone in the neighborhood. Well, almost everyone. Karen was, of course, left off the guest list. The night of the party arrived, and my yard buzzed with energy. Neighbors who had once lived in fear of Karen's rule laughed and danced without a care. Families splashed around in my newly upgraded pool, while kids chased each other with sparklers. It was everything Karen had tried to suppress. A community brought together, not torn apart. And right in the middle of the festivities, my personal touch. I had a custom sign made, placed right next to the pool for everyone to see. In bold, shimmering letters, it read, "From trash to treasure, "Welcome to the neighborhood's best pool party." The message wasn't subtle, and I knew it would get back to Karen. In fact, I made sure it did. Midway through the night, I caught a glimpse of her watching from her window, her face tight with jealousy. I raised a glass in her direction, offering a smile she absolutely did not return. But there was one last twist I hadn't revealed. Over the past few months, Karen's absence from the HOA meant that her property had been neglected. She had been so obsessed with making my life miserable that she hadn't noticed her own home falling into disrepair. I had already received multiple complaints from neighbors about her overgrown lawn and peeling paint. Ironically, the exact kind of infractions she used to fine others for. And, as vice president, I was responsible for handling those complaints. I sent Karen a formal violation letter, just like the ones she had loved to send me. Except I wasn't cruel or vindictive. I gave her a fair deadline to fix the issues, with a reminder that the HOA rules applied to everyone equally. To no one's surprise, she didn't comply. So I followed procedure. I issued a fine, ironically, the same amount she had tried to make me pay after dumping trash in my pool. When she refused to pay it, I escalated the matter, placing a lien on her property. A few months later, Karen quietly put her house up for sale. No farewell party, no dramatic outburst, just a bitter exit from a community that had moved on without her. The day she left, I stood on my perfectly manicured lawn, watching the moving truck pull away. It felt like the closing chapter to a long and exhausting battle, but one I had ultimately won. With Karen gone, the neighborhood continued to thrive. The HOA transformed into a force for good, focused on fostering community rather than controlling it. And my pool? It remained the heart of the neighborhood, symbolizing not just my personal victory, but the power of standing up against bullies. And every time I floated in that pool, soaking up the sun, I felt a deep satisfaction. Karen had tried to destroy my peace, but in the end, she had only built my legacy. And I wasn't going to let anyone take that away from me.